At 11:47, on a Tuesday night, a janitor's mop stops moving halfway across a marble floor in a tower built to look down on men like him. A security camera has just started blinking wrong, and only he can see it. He does not run. He does not call for help. He crosses to the electrical panel, like a man who has done this in darker places, in rooms with no windows in countries that never appeared on any map, with his name attached. 90 seconds. A quarter shorted against a live relay. The light steadies. The threat closes. Nobody in the glass offices 40 floors up will ever know how close something came tonight. But someone up there already knows his name. Someone has known it for 18 months. And buried in a file marked with lines no one was meant to read is a single order: remove him before it begins. The mop moves again. He has no idea it has already started. The lobby of Frost Tower smelled like money. Not the honest kind. Not diesel and sawdust and the sweat of a paycheck earned with 2 hands. This was the cold, filtered smell of marble, polished to a mirror of leather chairs. Nobody tired enough to need had ever sat in of air, scrubbed so clean it forgot where it came from. Ezra Calloway pushed his cart through the revolving doors at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and felt exactly nothing about any of it. I was 34. He didn't look soft. He looked like a man who'd lived hard and come out the other side, still standing. There were lines at the corners of his eyes carved by sun and salt water, and nights in places he wasn't allowed to name. His hands wrapped loose around the handle of an industrial mop cart were big and scarred and completely steady. To the cameras, he was nothing. A janitor starting his shift, which was exactly how Ezra liked it. He'd learned a long time ago that a place doesn't decide what a man is. What a man does inside it, that's the whole story. 14 months he'd been with Pro Clean. $19.75 an hour. 5 nights a week, the graveyard shift rotating through 3 towers in the financial district. The schedule was ugly, but it let him be home when Micah woke up. And that was the only thing about the job that ever mattered to him. Micah was 7. He had his mother's eyes. Deep brown, wide, able to say more in one look than most grown adults managed in an hour of talking. And he had his father's jaw already that square set that would define him someday as a man. He was small for his age, and completely unaware of it the way children are when they've been loved right. He thought the world was enormous and mostly good. Ezra intended to keep it that way, for as long as he was allowed. Tonight the boy was 2 doors down, staying with Winifred Pratt, the retired schoolteacher in 4B who had somehow become the closest thing to family Ezra had in this city. She charged him nothing, took nothing, just pressed a foil-covered plate into his hands every time he came to collect his son, like she understood without being told that a man raising a boy alone needs feeding in more ways than one. He always ate it standing at the kitchen counter. 2-3 in the morning, still in his work clothes, listening to the apartment breathe. He did not find it lonely. He'd known real loneliness. This wasn't that. He started on this ground floor the way he always did, and then he stopped, because the camera in the northeast corner was wrong. The little red light. It should pulse every second and a half. Steady, reliable. This one blinked. Waited, 3 blinked again. Off rhythm. Off just enough that 99 people out of 100 would never catch it. Ezra's heart rate didn't move, but everything under his skin shifted to a different frequency. Someone had gotten into the feed. He kept pushing the cart. Slow, unhurried. Just a man drifting toward the electrical panel by the elevator bank, adjusting his route. He opened it with the key maintenance had given him 6 months back when the overnight supervisor stopped bothering to show up. Inside the board hummed. His eyes moved over the breakers the way another man's might move over a familiar face. He'd shut down worse than this. In rooms with no windows. In countries that never appeared on a map with his name attached. A quarter from his pocket. He shorted the auxiliary relay. 90 seconds. No more. The camera light stuttered, then caught the right rhythm. Steady again. 1.5 seconds. Like nothing had happened. Because nothing had. That was the point. The security guard. Larry crossed the lobby, right then shoes clicking on the stone mind, already halfway home to a cold beer in the fridge. Evening Calloway. Ezra nodded. Didn't break stride. Larry didn't notice the camera had glitched. He wouldn't notice it had been fixed. He walked on a man at the tail end of his shift, carrying none of it. And that was fine. Ezra wasn't looking for credit. The breach had come from outside. A probe, most likely. Somebody testing the building's nerves for a soft spot. Corporate espionage, maybe. Or something dumber. He didn't speculate. Speculation without data was a way to lose, and Ezra had long ago stopped playing games he could lose. What mattered was simple. The building had been touched. He'd touched it back. And nobody in the executive suites 40 floors up would ever know their night janitor had just closed a door. Somebody very much wanted open. He went back to his cart and started mopping the northeast quadrant. He glanced up once. The 40th floor. A single corner office still burning at 1:45. Whoever was up there was working too hard. Or running from something. Ezra had learned to read a person's whole life just by the hours they kept. People who sat in their offices until midnight on a Tuesday were rarely people with somewhere better to be. The lobby took 40 minutes, done right. Baseboards, elevator tracks, the glass beside the revolving door that collected fingerprints all day, like a ledger of everyone who'd passed through. I was thorough. He'd been trained to be thorough. In another life, thoroughness was the difference between coming home and not. And that standard didn't shrink just because the stakes had. A clean floor was a clean floor. You did the job right, or you didn't do it at all. His phone buzzed at 12:15. He didn't check it. Micah was asleep at Winifred's. She wouldn't call unless the sky was falling, and her name lit up his screen different. This was something else. He finished his section, wrung the mop, and gave himself 30 seconds. A text. From Des Okafor. Brother, when you get a minute. Something you should probably know about. Ezra went very still. Because Des didn't use words like that lightly. Des chose his words the way he'd once chosen firing positions. From high ground, clear line. Committed before he ever pulled. Ezra put the phone away. He'd call when he got home. After Micah was safe in bed. After the world had narrowed down to the small hours where hard conversations belong. He was working the far corner near the elevators when the doors slid open at 12:22, and Adeline Frost stepped out. I knew her, of course. Her face hung on the wall by the security desk in a frame the size of a window, the kind of portrait corporations use to announce that someone matters. She was the CEO. She was 32. She'd taken a small fintech thing and built it into something worth $850 million. And for 3 years, the business press had been writing profiles that used words like visionary and ruthless and brilliant in the same breath as if those three naturally belonged together. In person, she was smaller than the photograph promised. Not in height. She stood straight, moved like someone used to rooms rearranging themselves around her. But there was something behind the eyes the camera had airbrushed out. Something clenched. Something that had been holding on too tight for too long. She was on her phone. She didn't see him. Ezra eased his cart a little to the left, gave her room. Standard courtesy. She walked straight into the wet stretch he'd just mopped. Her heel skidded on the damp marble. She caught herself against the wall with a sharp, furious little sound. The phone leapt from her hand and skated 6 feet across the floor. And in the silence after she looked up, her eyes found him, traveled from his face to the logo stitched over his pocket, to the mop, to the yellow wet floor sign standing 3 feet to her right, the one she hadn't seen, then back to his face, and something moved behind her eyes. Something Ezra had watched happen before, in people who suddenly needed to be bigger than the moment they were caught inside. "What are you doing?" "I almost fell." Ezra said nothing, because nothing he'd learned is often the loudest thing you can offer. Her chest rose and fell, that careful, deliberate breathing of a person fighting to keep her voice level, fighting to put back together the composure that had cracked the second her heel lost the floor. Do you understand what almost fell means? Do you understand the liability that is in this building? She gestured at the marble, the glass, the portrait of herself, serene, on the wall behind her. You're supposed to have the main floor done before midnight. That's the arrangement. That's what this company pays for. "The sign's up," Ezra said. Quiet. He nodded toward the yellow marker standing exactly where it should be. "I don't care about the sign. I care that my floor is wet at midnight, and I nearly broke my—" She stopped, bent, picked up the phone, checked it for cracks with the tight anxiety of someone whose whole life lived inside 6 inches of glass. Her hands weren't quite steady. Not from fear, from adrenaline and anger, and something Ezra recognized from a long way off the very edge of a person's ability to hold it all together. "What's your name?" "Ezra Calloway." "Ezra." She said it the way people say a word they're about to cross off a list. "I'm calling clean in the morning. I want a different crew on this building. People who know how to do a job without creating hazards for the people who actually run this place." She looked at him another half-second. Not like a person, like a problem noted to be dealt with. Then she turned and walked toward the revolving door phone already back at her ear, heels striking the marble like a clock that had no more time to waste on him. Ezra watched her go. He picked up the sign she'd knocked crooked and set it upright again. Wrung out the mop, kept cleaning. What Adeline Frost didn't see, what she couldn't have, because nothing about a pro-clean uniform tells this story, was the small thing that shifted in Ezra's chest pocket when he leaned down to straighten that sign. A piece of metal. Military. The kind that isn't handed out at routine ceremonies. The kind that doesn't come in a box with a certificate you'd hang on a wall. The kind pressed quietly into a man's hand by someone in a room with no windows, with instructions about what it meant, and stricter instructions about what it must never be allowed to mean out loud. He'd carried it 11 years, not out of pride. He carried it because Micah had found it once on a shelf in the closet and asked what it was. And Ezra had said it was something from back when Daddy had a different job. And Micah had held it in both small hands with such serious, careful reverence that Ezra had never been able to put it back on that shelf again. So it lived in his pocket, closest to his chest. A secret the marble lobby had no interest in knowing. He finished the ground floor at 1:15, riding the service elevator. Up. He thought about Micah, asleep in Winifred's spare room, probably curled around the stuffed dog he'd had since he was 2. He thought about pancakes in the morning. He thought about nothing else. Not Adeline Frost, not the call she meant to make. The second floor was open plan. Long rows of desks, glass-walled conference rooms, the residue of a full workday left behind by people who assumed someone else would handle it. A mug abandoned by a keyboard. A granola wrapper beside the trash can instead of in it. A sticky note face up on the carpet, call back underlined twice. Ezra collected it all without judgment. The job was to put a room back to neutral, to hand tomorrow a clean place to start. He understood that as its own kind of dignity. He'd always been good at being unseen. In the field, it was a skill. Training discipline, an almost inhuman stillness. Here it was just a fact. A uniform. A cart. A job title that made most people's eyes slide right past him the way eyes slide past furniture. It used to trouble him. Months it troubled him. Until he understood the trouble itself was the wrong answer. Because worth was never something you got from the attention of people who didn't know you. Worth was tallied somewhere quieter. In the private books of your own conscience. Every night. Never falsified. Ezra Calloway knew exactly what he was worth. He'd paid for every cent of that knowing in places this marble could not imagine. He got home at 3:49. The building had gone up in 1962 and been renovated just often enough, to stay technically alive. The hallway held the ghosts of other people's dinners, garlic something fried earlier in the week. He'd stopped smelling it long ago. These were the smells of a working building. People who came home tired, fed their families, went back out, did it again. He didn't find it sad. On his better nights, he found it close to beautiful. He showered first, always, because he wouldn't carry the chemical smell of the job into the space where his son slept. A small thing. A private rule. But Ezra ran his whole life on private rules because he'd learned that structure wasn't a cage. It was a skeleton. Pull it out, and everything else collapses. So, shower. Gray shirt, sweatpants. Then 20 minutes at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, and the particular quiet of a city at 4 in the morning, which is different from every other quiet. Deeper, more honest. The city at 4 a.m. isn't performing for anybody. On the table beside his coffee was a drawing. Micah left one every night now. 6 months, this habit. A picture waiting for his father to find when he came home. Tonight's was green and blue, and one determined streak of orange. And it showed 2 figures on a hill under a sun that took up half the sky, and something in the foreground that Ezra studied for a full minute before he understood it was a dog. They didn't own a dog. Micah wanted one with the ferocity that surfaced at regular intervals in conversations that always ended the same way. Someday Ezra always said, "When we have a yard." And Micah always accepted it, trusted him, in a way that made Ezra feel the full weight of every promise he'd ever made. He folded the drawing careful and slid it into the kitchen drawer with the others. 47 of them. He knew the exact number, because he'd never thrown a single one away. And he never would. He picked up the phone. Read the message again. Something you should probably know about. Ezra looked down the dark hall toward his son's door. At the metal in the pocket of the shirt he'd just hung up. At the life he'd built out of the ruins of another one 3 years ago, when Rosalind died and took half the light in the world with her. He'd call Des in the morning, because whatever this was, it could wait until the sun came up. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to touch the boy. Sleeping 2 rooms away. That's what he told himself. And for one more night in the honest quiet of a city that wasn't watching Ezra Calloway got to be right. Ezra woke at 9 without an alarm. His body had kept military time so long it no longer needed telling. 4 hours of sleep, and he was up clean the way he always was, because the alternative lying there, letting the mind wander back to rooms he'd left, had never once done him any good. He went down the hall to collect Micah from Winifred's. The boy was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table, eating toast, and explaining something at length. His small hands moved with the articulate enthusiasm of a child who's just learned a new fact and cannot understand why the whole world hasn't been informed yet. Winifred listened with the patience of a woman who'd spent 30 years in a classroom and never once stopped loving the shape of a child's mind. "He's been up since 6, she told Ezra. "Not a complaint, a report. He has opinions about the ocean floor now." "Dad." Micah was off the chair and across the kitchen in 3 steps, both arms locked around Ezra's waist, with the full-body commitment of a boy who hasn't yet learned to hold anything back. Ezra put a hand on the back of his son's head, held it there. The weight of Micah's skull against his palm was the most real thing in Ezra's life. More real than the metal in his pocket. More real than the marble 40 floors up. More real than anything he'd done or seen in the decade before this boy was born. "Mrs. Pratt says there are creatures down deep that make their own light," Micah said, tilting his face up. "Because there's no sun down there, so they had to figure it out themselves." "They figured it out themselves," Ezra repeated. Grave, like a man receiving intelligence. "Isn't that the coolest thing you ever heard?" "It might be." Winifred caught Ezra's eye over the boy's head, and she smiled at him. Not sentimental, nothing soft about it, just recognition. She knew what it cost a man to do what he was doing. Her husband had understood that particular arithmetic before he passed. She asked for nothing. She gave freely. And Ezra had never in his life figured out how to properly account for that kind of grace. He made pancakes when they got upstairs. It was the anchor of the week, the steady thing in a schedule that had no other steadiness in it. Micah sat on the counter, a privilege granted only on pancake mornings, and supervised reporting on the bubbles forming in the batter, like a scientist narrating an experiment. Ezra flipped one without a spatula when the boy wasn't looking, the way his own father used to. "Dad, how did you do that?" "Practice." "I want to learn." "Someday. When your hands are bigger." Another someday. Another promise the drawer would eventually have to hold. And Ezra almost laughed at himself because his whole life with this boy was becoming a ledger of some days: the dog, the spatula, Flip, the yard, the museum. Little IOUs handed over one at a time, except he meant to pay every single one. That was the thing about Ezra's some days. They weren't ways of saying no. They were contracts. After breakfast, while Micah watched a nature documentary he'd already seen 4 times, Ezra sat down with his phone, and his stomach went quiet. Not nervous. Attentive. The way it had been trained to go registering a threat before the conscious mind caught up holding the information without reacting to it. There was a message from his supervisor, Gary, sent at 7:53. "Call me when you get a chance." You could hear the tone even in text. The tone of a man who's been leaned on and doesn't enjoy it. Ezra knew what the call would be. He'd known since 12:30 the night before, when Adeline Frost walked away from him across that wet marble, with her phone already at her ear. He just hadn't let himself process it yet, because there'd been a boy on his counter narrating bubbles, and that boy's whole world required his father fully present in it. Not somewhere else. Not carrying tomorrow's weight where a 7-year-old might feel it settle on his shoulders. He stepped into the bedroom and called. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Adeline Frost had called ProClean at 8:15. She hadn't spoken to Gary. She'd spoken to Gary's boss, Raymond, who'd then spoken to Gary. The word they were using was reassigned, not fired. Reassigned. Gary said it like the distinction meant something, and Ezra let him believe it did. "I understand," Ezra said. "Level. Thanks for telling me. I'll figure it out." He didn't mention the sign, standing right where it should have been plain as day. He didn't mention the time, or the schedule, or the fact that the lobby had been started on time, and a tired woman in a hurry had simply not looked where she was walking. None of that would change anything. None of that was the point. The point was old as the world. A person with power made a call. A person without power absorbed it. That was the oldest equation there is, and Ezra had no illusions left about it. He sat on the edge of the bed for 3 minutes after the call ended doing the math. Rent was $1,420. Micah's school lunch was covered, but after-school care ran $210 a month. Groceries, utilities. The minimum on the card he'd been slowly paying down since he left the service. It all arranged itself in his head with the brisk clarity of a man who'd been managing tight margins so long the numbers had their own weight and shape. He could pick up the suburban route. The office parks out past the interchange. Less an hour. A bus at 4:30 in the morning. He noted it, set it aside as workable, and moved on. Because the important thing was that Micah would be fine. Ezra would make sure of it. That wasn't optimism. That was just the settled fact of a man who'd already decided. He went back to the living room. Micah had fallen asleep on the couch, the way he sometimes did when the early hours caught up to him. Shoes still on. Ezra unlaced them, set them on the floor, pulled the blanket down over him. And he stood there a moment, looking at his son's sleeping face, at the complete, uncomplicated piece of it, at the way Micah's chest rose and fell with the easy confidence of a boy who had never once lain awake, wondering whether the rent was covered. That was the whole job, Ezra thought. Right there. To stand between that piece and everything that wanted to take it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Dez's message. Still waiting. He stepped out onto the narrow balcony that looked down over the parking lot, and he called his old teammate. Dez picked up on the second ring. "Brother." "Dez. You got my message." "I did. What's going on?" There was a pause. The kind that meant Dez was choosing his words the way he chose everything carefully, because he understood that information once handed over can't be handed back. "You still on that building, Frost Tower?" "Got reassigned this morning." "Why?" Ezra exhaled. Below him, a shopping cart somebody had abandoned rocked against the fence in the wind. CEO slipped on a wet floor. Took it personal. Dez was quiet a beat too long. "That's okay. That's actually what I was calling about." Another breath. "You remember a few months back you mentioned the job. I did some digging. For your sake. Wanted to make sure the company was solid before my brother handed them 14 months of his life. And ProClean's parent is buried under 7 layers of shell entities. Real estate holdings, limited partnerships, the whole obfuscation playbook. Took me 2 days to trace it back to the source." Ezra waited. Dez always built to something. Dez had never once opened with the shot. "At the top of the chain," Dez said, "is a network controlled by Thaddeus Vance." Ezra's hand tightened on the rail. "The Billionaire." "The same. And he owns 45% of Frost Capital. That's the company." In the building you just got kicked out of. Ezra stood very still and let the pieces settle the way he'd once let a room settle, before he moved through it. His employer, and the CEO who'd fired him. Two ends of the same rope. "So my company's connected to the woman who let me go," he said, flat, testing the shape of it out loud. "It's worse than that." Dez's voice dropped half a register. "Vance's security team flagged your file 18 months ago. Background check on all building service personnel at his Tier 1 properties. Your service record came up." A pause. The redactions came up. Ezra closed his eyes. The redactions. The blacked-out lines in his file that told anyone who knew how to read them that Ezra Calloway was not what the uniform said he was. Flagged how? "They noticed you're not just a janitor." That's how Grant put it. Wesley Grant. Another name of the old life. Another man who'd been there when the rounds were real and the mission parameters were classified, and coming home was never a promise anybody could make you. You talk to Grant. He does private security consulting now. Has access to databases that'd turn your hair white. He pulled Vance's internal security memos easy. Dez let that sit. "There's a directive. 18 months old. And I want to read it to you exactly. Identify and remove any personnel with advanced tactical training from Frost Tower before Phase 2. Ezra opened his eyes. The parking lot below was empty. A rusted sedan, the wind, the ordinary Wednesday going on being ordinary for everybody who didn't know what he now knew. "Before Phase 2, he said, "Grant thinks Vance is moving on something big, something that involves Adeline Frost, the CEO. A beat, the woman who just had you reassigned." And Ezra's mind was already 3 steps ahead, already laying the pieces down, already seeing the shape underneath the shape. Because you don't put a man like that, a man who notices anywhere near a building. You're about to do something dirty inside. You clear him out first. Quiet. Clean. Before he can become the one thing an operation like that can't survive. A witness. "They wanted me gone before they moved on her," he said. "That's what Grant thinks. You're a trained operator with a clearance. You see things other people walk past. And when men like Vance run dirty operations..." Dez didn't finish. He didn't have to. They don't leave witnesses. Ezra was quiet a long moment. Through the sliding glass, he could see Micah still asleep on the couch, one small hand curled beneath his cheek. "I'm not a witness, Dez. I clean floors. You were a SEAL. That's enough for Vance to want you gone. What's he planning? Don't know yet. But there's an SEC complaint, leaked emails, board pressure, every fingerprint of a corporate coup. Grant still pulling threads." The wind came up cool, first real breath of autumn in it. "And you're telling me this, why?" Ezra said. Not sharp, just needing to hear him say it. "Because you need to watch your back, and because I thought you should know your reassignment wasn't random." A pause. "It was tactical." Ezra nodded, though Dez couldn't see it. "Understood. Thank you." Another pause. Then Dez's voice came back lower. The voice of a man who'd carried other men off of other floors and never got over any of it. "What are you gonna do?" Ezra looked through the glass at his son. At the drawer full of 47 drawings. At the whole careful life he'd assembled out of the wreck of the one he'd walked away from. "I don't know yet," he said. And he meant it. He ended the call and stood on the balcony another 10 minutes, watching the sky pale over the eastern rooftops, watching the world wake up around him without the faintest idea what was moving underneath it. He thought about his father. His father had run a barber shop for 33 years. Cut hair for city councilmen and for men who walked in with their last $10, and gave them both the exact same attention. Taught Ezra by pure example that dignity wasn't a place you arrived at. It was something you practiced daily, in the small decisions, in how you moved through the world when nobody was keeping score. His father had been invisible too, the way certain good men are invisible, the ones who show up without being asked, who endure without editorializing. And Ezra had understood, watching that man for 23 years, that the inheritance he was getting wasn't money. It was something more durable than money, a way of standing in the world, a way of taking whatever came without breaking your posture. He thought about the metal in his pocket. I thought about the woman in the marble lobby who'd looked at him and seen nothing worth seeing. And he thought about Thaddeus Vance, a man he had never met, who had nonetheless decided 18 months ago, in some room Ezra would never enter, that Ezra Calloway was a problem to be removed from the board. And here was the thing that wouldn't leave him alone. The thing that changed everything. Powerful men don't go to the trouble of removing janitors, unless those janitors are standing too close to something the powerful men need nobody to see. He went back inside. Micah was stirring, eyelids fluttering. Ezra sat down beside him on the couch and waited for his son to surface the way he always did, because there was no version of his life in which he wasn't there when the boy opened his eyes. Micah blinked, focused on his father's face, smiled. "Did I fall asleep?" "You did. Can we go to the park?" Ezra looked at the clock. 10:47, Thursday morning. He'd lost his assignment. He had no idea what next week's schedule looked like. He had a Billionaire's security apparatus, apparently, that had known his name and his history for a year and a half. And his son wanted to go to the park. "Yeah, buddy," Ezra said. "We can go to the park." They walked the 6 blocks to Riverside, Micah's hand in his, the boy, narrating a theory about what would happen if the deep-sea light creatures ever came up to the surface, whether they'd still glow or whether the sun would drown them out. Ezra listened with his whole attention, because he did not give this boy partial attention. Whatever Micah said was worth hearing all the way through, not because everything a 7-year-old says carries weight, but because the act of being genuinely heard was one of the few things a father could hand a child that would still be doing its quiet work 50 years later. At the park, Micah ran for the swings. Ezra pushed him the arc, climbing higher, with every pass, the boy's laughter cutting the cool September air like something bright and clean. There were other parents, mostly mothers' younger kids. They glanced at Ezra with the brief, careful curiosity people reserve for a man alone with a child during school hours. Ezra didn't meet their eyes. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there because his son wanted to swing, and he'd promised, and he kept his promises. That was the entire content of the moment, and it was enough. On the walk home, Micah asked the question he'd been circling all morning. "Dad, when I'm bigger, can I have a job like yours?" Ezra considered it. "What do you think my job is?" "You clean buildings. You make them nice for people." "That's right. So can I do that too?" Ezra stopped walking. He knelt down so he was eye level with his son. "You can do anything you want, buddy. Anything at all. You can clean buildings if that's what makes you happy. You can build them. You can draw them." He tapped the boy's chest once, gentle. "The job doesn't matter. What matters is that you do it with your whole heart. You understand me?" Micah nodded, his small face serious. "Like you do." Ezra held that for a second. Like like I try to. They walked the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that isn't empty. And Ezra made grilled cheese and Micah ate his, describing the relative depths of the ocean, and Ezra ate his thinking about Thaddeus Vance and Adeline Frost, and the decision that was quietly becoming a decision whether he wanted it to or not. Because Des had made it one. The knowledge that his reassignment wasn't random, that it was one clean move in a larger game, that it was designed to sweep the board clear before something happened to a woman Ezra did not know and had no particular reason to care about. That knowledge changed the math. He could walk away. Take the suburban route, ride the 4:30 bus, come home later, see less of his boy, and let whatever was going to happen to Adeline Frost happen, without him anywhere near it. That was the smart play. The safe play. That was what a man with a 7-year-old and $1,400 in rent should do. Except Ezra hadn't carried a piece of metal in his pocket for 11 years because he made the safe play. He'd carried it because he'd learned in places he couldn't name that some things are worth the cost. And walking away from a thing you can see clearly, a person being deliberately dismantled by someone powerful enough to do it, and never answer for it. That wasn't the man Ezra wanted his son to find. When the boy looked up at his father, the night after Micah was asleep, Ezra opened his laptop, and he started to read. Thaddeus Vance, SEC, Frost Capital. The first result was 3 weeks old. Wall Street Chronicle. Questions surround Frost Capital's Q3 projections. The byline said Jordan Pierce. Ezra read it twice. It cited an anonymous source close to the company. Claimed Adeline Frost had known about a serious revenue shortfall and tried to hide it from the board and from regulators. Quoted what it called an internal email in which Frost allegedly discussed revising Q3 projections down by 40%. Ezra sat back, because he'd been trained to read intelligence, to sort signal from noise, to find the gap in a story where the manipulation had slipped in. And this story had gaps. It quoted the email but didn't show it. It cited a source but offered no corroboration. It built its whole case on implication instead of evidence. That wasn't how honest journalism worked. That was how a planted story worked. He searched again. Thaddeus Vance. Corporate takeovers. And the pattern lit up like a flare in the dark. Same move 3 times over the past several years. Find a target company. Compromise the CEO with leaked information or a manufactured scandal. Apply pressure through the board. Force a resignation. Install new leadership. Acquire control. Ezra looked at the framed photo on his desk. Micah grinning, holding up a plastic dinosaur, his whole face lit up. And he thought about the promise he'd made to Rosalind. 3 years ago, standing beside a hospital bed, while the machines kept their steady rhythm, and she looked at him with eyes that already knew she wasn't coming home. Promise me you'll take care of him. Promise me he'll grow up knowing what a good man looks like. I promise. She'd died 6 hours later, and Ezra had kept every promise he'd made her since. In pancakes and permission slips and patient answers about the ocean floor. But that one, the promise about showing his son what a good man looked like, that one required more than domesticity. That one asked him sometimes to be the man he'd been trained to be. The one who doesn't walk away when he sees wrong being done in plain sight. He picked up his phone and texted Des. I need everything Grant has on Vance, and I need a way to reach his former assistant, the one who got let go. The reply came 3 minutes later. You sure about this? Ezra looked at the metal sitting on the desk beside his son's photograph. Bronze. Cool. Heavier than 2 ounces had any right to be. No, he typed. But I'm doing it anyway. The answer was immediate. I'll set it up. Ezra closed the laptop and sat a long time in the dark kitchen, listening to the building settle around him. He thought about his father's hand steady and sure over a stranger's head. He thought about the drawing in the drawer, the 2 figures on the hill, and the dog that didn't exist yet, and the word, someday, he'd handed his son like a promissory note. Then he stood and walked down the hall and stopped in the doorway of Micah's room. The boy was asleep on his back, one arm thrown up over his head, the stuffed dog tucked against his side. Ezra watched him breathe. I spent 10 years protecting strangers, he thought. Maybe it's time I protected someone who actually needs it. He went back to the kitchen and picked up the metal and put it in the pocket of tomorrow's shirt, closest to the chest, where his son had first placed it the day he looked up and said, "You're a hero, Dad," where it would stay, until Ezra had earned the right to set it down for good. Adeline Frost hadn't slept in 2 years. Not properly. Not the way you sleep when the world feels solid underneath you. The insomnia had moved in around the time the company crossed 500 million, when the only pressure that mattered became the pressure to keep climbing, and it had never once packed its bags and left. So she was already awake at 6:15 that Wednesday, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, applying makeup with the mechanical precision of a woman who had done this so many times that conscious thought was no longer required. Foundation, concealer, the thin armor that would carry her through whatever the day demanded. Her reflection stared back with eyes that had managed maybe 3 hours. She left the apartment at 7, drove the 12 minutes to Frost Tower, and discovered at 8:30 that her keycard would not open the executive elevator. The little light above the reader blinked red 3 times, then went dark. She tried again. Red, a red, a red, and a knot formed in her stomach, cold and heavy, arriving before her conscious mind had finished putting the pieces together, because the body always knows first. The body reads the room before the brain is willing to. Larry the guard appeared from the security desk, wearing the face of a man who'd been handed instructions he wished he hadn't been. "Ms. Frost, I've been asked to direct you to conference room 3C. Her voice came out colder than she meant it to. Reflex, a way to cover the fear starting its slow climb up from her chest. Directed by whom? Larry shifted his weight. Mr. Vance's office, ma'am. She nodded once. She did not thank him, and she took the stairs, because the thought of standing inside a small metal box with her own thoughts for company was suddenly unbearable. Her heels struck the concrete in sharp reports that ricocheted up the stairwell, and each step down felt like a step toward something final. Something that had been set in motion long before this morning. Long before she'd had any chance at all to stop it. Conference room 3C had a glass wall facing the corridor and a table long enough to seat 14. She pushed the door open, and Thaddeus Vance was already seated at the head of it. To his right, 2 attorneys in dark suits briefcases squared with the symmetry of soldiers at attention. To his left, Preston Kane, her chief financial officer. A man she had hired 4 years ago. A man she had trusted with the entire architecture of the company's money. And beside Preston, the director of human resources, her face arranged into that careful neutrality HR professionals learn to wear when they're about to deliver something that will end a career. Adeline. Vance's voice was smooth, almost kind. The voice of a man who had done this enough times to know exactly which register to use. Please, sit down. She stayed standing. She stayed. The door clicked shut behind her, and the room got smaller. The air got thicker. And she understood with a clarity that arrived all at once that she was outnumbered, outpositioned, and that whatever was about to happen had been decided before she ever walked through that door. Vance slid a manila folder across the polished table. It came to rest in front of the empty chair facing him. "The board has raised serious concerns," he said, "regarding recent financial disclosures and the SEC inquiry into the Q3 projections." Her hand stayed at her sides. She didn't reach for it. "What concerns?" One of the attorney's silver hair, rimless glasses opened his own folder and drew out a single sheet. "There are questions about the accuracy of revenue projections provided to the board in August. Specifically, whether certain material information was withheld or misrepresented." She felt the blood leave her face. "That's not true." Vance's expression didn't move. "The board has reviewed the evidence. They feel a change in leadership is prudent." And Adeline finally moved. She pulled out the chair, sat, opened the folder. Inside was a resignation letter, already formatted, company letterhead signature lines at the bottom. Below it, a list of board members. 6 of 9 had already signed. The word voluntary appeared 3 times in the first paragraph. 18 months of salary. Health benefits for the same. A non-disclosure agreement attached as Exhibit A. "This is a termination," she said, dressed up as a resignation. "The board prefers the term mutual separation." Vance folded his hands. "A man with all the time in the world. You'll receive positive references. The transition will be handled with discretion." Adeline looked at Preston Kane. Her CFO would not meet her eyes. His gaze fixed on some point past her left shoulder. The look of a man who has made a choice he cannot defend and knows it. "Preston." His voice was barely there. "Adeline." The numbers raised questions I couldn't answer. "What numbers?" She heard her own voice climbing and couldn't stop it. "The Q3 email was an internal discussion. I said we might need to revise projections if the European market slowed. That's prudent risk assessment. That's not fraud." Vance reached into his own folder and produced a printed email. Her name in the sender line. Preston's in the recipient. The date, February 22nd. The body. 3 sentences. Q3 projections will be revised down by 40%. European contracts are not materializing as forecast. Do not share this with the board until I decide how to frame it. Adeline stared at it. Her pulse hammered in her throat. "That's not what I wrote. That's the email Preston forwarded to the board." She grabbed her phone from her bag, opened her email, scrolled back to February, found the original. Turned the screen to face Preston. "Is this what you forwarded?" Preston leaned in, and his face went pale. That's not the version I sent." Vance's voice stayed level. "Regardless of which version was sent, the damage is done. The SEC has opened an inquiry. Institutional investors are asking questions. The board has lost confidence." Adeline set the phone down on the table, and she looked at Thaddeus Vance with the full force of everything that had just clicked into place. "You altered that email. That's a serious accusation. And this is a serious coup." Her voice had gone very quiet. How long have you been planning this?" Something flickered across Vance's face. There then gone, behind the professional neutrality, a shadow of satisfaction. "I've been planning for the company's future. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions. I built this company from nothing. And we're grateful. But fiduciary responsibility means knowing when to step aside. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. "Ms. Frost, if you refuse to sign, the board will vote publicly. The outcome will be the same. The process will simply be messier. For everyone." Adeline stood. She picked up the folder, held it for a moment, then set it back down. "I won't sign this." Vance nodded, as if he had expected exactly that. "Then we'll reconvene the board next week for a formal vote. I'd suggest you have counsel present." She walked to the door, her legs unsteady as if the floor had turned uncertain beneath her, and she paused, one hand on the handle, and looked back at Preston Kane. "You worked for me for 4 years. I trusted you." Preston finally met her eyes. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Adeline left. She took the stairs back up to her office, or what had been her office until 20 minutes ago. Her things were already boxed. A cardboard box on the floor beside her desk. Someone had moved fast. Someone had been ready. Inside a framed photograph of her parents. A small succulent she'd kept on the windowsill. 2 books she'd annotated to death in the early days, when the company was just an idea and a rented room and a belief that she could build something real. Everything else was gone. She carried the box down to the lobby. 10:15 in the morning. Employees moved through the space with the purposeful distraction of people who'd heard something and didn't want to be caught knowing it. She walked past them without meeting a single eye, pushed through the revolving door, and stood on the sidewalk in the cool air holding a box that contained the entire personal remainder of a company she had created with her own 2 hands. Her car was in a garage 3 blocks away. She walked there in a trance, the box growing heavier with every step, and she sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, staring at a concrete wall, trying to assemble one coherent thought out of the wreckage of the morning. Her phone buzzed and buzzed. Colleagues, her attorney. 2 voicemails. She ignored all of it, because the only person she wanted to talk to was someone who understood what this felt like. And that person did not exist in the life she had so carefully built. She had no close friends, no partner, no confidant who wasn't also a colleague, which meant no confidant at all. She thought about calling her mother. Loretta Frost would answer on the 2nd ring. She always did. She'd listen with the patience of a woman who'd spent 30 years waiting tables and absorbing other people's problems for tips. She'd say something kind, something insufficient, and Adeline would feel worse for having made the call, because that was the thing about her and her mother. Somewhere along the climb, somewhere between the rented room and the 850 million Adeline had stopped calling. Not from anger. From something harder to name. A kind of shame she couldn't have explained if you'd asked her. As though every rung she climbed put another mile between the woman she'd become and the small kitchen in the small house where a tired woman had once counted tip money at midnight, so her daughter could have things she never had. Loretta had never asked for anything back, which somehow made it worse, so Adeline didn't call. She sat in the silence of the car instead. Absolute silence. And she closed her eyes. And for the first time in 6 years, she let herself cry. Not the polite kind. Not the kind you can blink away in a boardroom bathroom and reapply concealer over. Real crying. The kind that comes up from the center of the chest and empties out something that's been held too tight for too long. She cried for 10 minutes, and when she was done, she felt hollow, but strangely clear, because the tears hadn't fixed anything. They'd only confirmed what she already knew. She was alone. She had built her whole life to be alone. And now that the structure had collapsed, there was nobody left to help her rebuild it. She drove home. She sat in her apartment and looked at the harbor view that had once felt like proof of everything, and now felt like proof of nothing. She opened her laptop, started drafting an email to her attorney, and stopped, because the words felt pointless. Vance had the board. He had fabricated the evidence. He had turned her own CFO against her. What was an attorney supposed to do against that? Her phone rang. A number she didn't know. She answered. Because answering felt like doing something, and doing something felt better than sitting still. Hello. Ms. Frost. My name is Jordan Pierce. I'm a reporter with the Wall Street Chronicle. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about the SEC inquiry. Her throat tightened. No comment. I understand this is a difficult time, but there are details I think the public deserves to know. Then talk to Thaddeus Vance. He seems eager to control the narrative. She ended the call. The phone rang again, immediately. She turned it off, and Wednesday dissolved into a kind of suspended animation. She sat on the couch, ordered food she didn't eat, turned the fabricated email over and over in her mind, the one Preston had forwarded, the one that was not the email she had written, and tried to understand how the alteration had even been possible. Someone with technical skill, someone with access to the servers, someone working for Thaddeus Vance. By the next morning, she'd made a decision. She would not sign. She would force the board to vote. She would make Vance do it publicly in a room full of witnesses with his fingerprints all over it. It wouldn't save her job, but it would create a record. And records she'd learned have a way of surfacing eventually. She called her attorney. They talked for 40 minutes. He was pessimistic, but willing to fight. They set a meeting for the following morning, and Adeline felt the first faint stirring of something that wasn't quite hope, but sat next to it. She was not going to disappear quietly. That evening, she went for a run along the river to clear her head. Overcast sky, 4 miles breath coming, hard legs burning. And when she got back, she showered and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and laid out the timeline of the thing that had happened to her. February. The email. March. The leak to Jordan Pierce. April. The SEC inquiry. Spring into summer. The closed-door board meetings she'd been told were routine. And then this week, the revoked keycard, the folder, the end. It was a slow, patient, beautifully constructed operation. Vance had moved with the understanding that corporate coups don't succeed through force. They succeed through erosion. Credibility chipped away. Trust broken. Allies quietly turned one at a time until by the moment the final move comes, the outcome is already inevitable. She had been dismantled over 6 months, and she'd never seen a single piece of it coming. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number. Conference room, 3C, Saturday, 9:20 a.m. Come alone. Bring nothing. She stared at it. It could be a trap. Another humiliation engineered by Vance. A way to get her alone in the building she'd been thrown out of. Except, it could also be something else. Information. Evidence. A hand extended in the dark. She typed. Who is this? No answer. She waited 5 minutes, typed again. I'll be there. Saturday morning she woke at 6:30. She dressed with care. A navy suit, the one that projected confidence without aggression. She left at 8:15. Drove to Frost Tower. The building was near empty, on a weekend security thin. She entered through the main lobby, nodded to a weekend guard who barely looked up from his phone, and took the stairs to the 3rd floor. 3C was dark. She pushed the door open, and there was a man sitting at the far end of the table. Not in a suit, jeans, a gray jacket, no tie. It took her a second to place him, and when she did, the recognition landed with a jolt of pure confusion. The janitor, the one she'd had reassigned, for mopping the lobby. "How did you get in here?" "The sub-level door has a faulty latch." His voice was low, even. "Been broken 11 weeks. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. "Why am I here?" He pushed a folder across the table toward her. "Because you deserve to know the truth." She approached slowly, as if the folder might contain something that could hurt her. She sat. She opened it. 2 sheets of paper, printed side by side. On the left, an email. Her email. The one she'd sent Preston Kane in February. "Q3 projections might need revision if the European market drops. We should model conservative scenarios. Let's discuss Monday." On the right, the same email. Different words. The altered version. The one that said will be revised down by 40%. "Do not share this with the board." Her hands began to tremble. This is my email, but the right side is different. The left is what you wrote. The right is what Vance handed the SEC. "How did you get this? Not important right now." She looked up, and her voice came out harder than she meant it. A grab for some scrap of control in a room where she had none. "Who are you? Really?" The man reached into his jacket and set something on the table between them, a piece of metal. Dark bronze. A ribbon. Adeline's father had never served, but she'd stood at enough Memorial Day services, seen enough of these behind enough glass, to know she was looking at something that was not handed out lightly. Something that meant a man had done something most people would never be asked to do, and lived and been told to keep quiet about it. It sat there between them, catching the fluorescent light. "My name is Ezra Calloway, Navy SEAL. 3 combat deployments I can talk about. 2 I can't." A pause. "Retired with honors." She stared at the metal, then at the man. 6 days ago, you fired me for mopping your lobby. I'm not here about that." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her. Steady. No pity in it. No ambition either. Just resolve, the plain, settled look of a man who has already decided what's right and intends to see it through. "Because what Vance did to you is wrong," Ezra said, "and I was trained to fight when things are wrong." And Adeline felt something crack open in her chest. A fault line she hadn't known was there. "Why would you help me?" Her voice barely held. "I was terrible to you. You were tired and stressed, and someone slipped on a floor." He said it without weight, without accusation. "That's human. What Vance did, that's calculated. There's a difference." Her throat closed. "I don't even know you." "You know enough." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm the man who watched you fall. I'm the man who didn't argue when you fired me. And I'm the man sitting here now, giving you a choice." "What choice? Fight back. A beat. Or let him win." Adeline was silent a long moment. She looked down at the 2 emails again. At the proof of her own words, twisted into something she'd never say. At the confirmation of every suspicion she hadn't let herself fully believe until this exact second. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to trust me," Ezra said. "And when the time comes, I need you to walk into that boardroom and tell the truth." "And you'll do what?" "I'll make sure the truth has teeth." She met his eyes. and she realized she was crying again, and this time she didn't care to stop it, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her and seen not a CEO, not a liability, not a problem to be managed, but a person. Worth catching. When she fell. "Thank you," she said. Ezra stood. He slid the metal back into the pocket over his chest. "Don't thank me yet." He picked up the folder and closed it, and set it gently in front of her, hers to keep now. "We still have a lot of work to do." On Monday morning, Ezra met Des Okafor at a coffee shop on Grand Avenue. The place was half empty. Breakfast rush over lunch crowd not yet arrived. Des was already in a corner booth when Ezra walked in, and he'd aged well leaner in the face than a decade ago, gray, coming in at the temples. But the eyes were the same. Sharp, alert. The eyes of a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. "Brother." Des stood. They embraced. Brief. The way men who've carried each other off of bad ground don't need to explain what the embrace is for. Ezra slid into the booth. Des pushed a small USB drive across the table. Everything Grant could pull on Vance's network. Shell companies, wire transfers, employment contracts. It's all on there. Ezra pocketed it. "Give me the headline." "Vance has been planning this at least 6 months. Probably longer." Des lowered his voice. He hired a tech consultant. Man named Dylan Foss. Foss specializes in what he calls digital forensics, which means fabricating evidence, cleanly. Foss gets into the company's email servers, pulls the original message, alters the text, puts it back with the original timestamp intact. A pause. Unless you saved the original somewhere else, there's no way to prove it was ever touched. Ezra sat with that. Except Adeline saved her emails locally. Then she's one step ahead of most people Vance takes apart. Most of them never even get to argue. Ezra leaned back. Who else knows? Grant's been talking to a woman, Marguerite Brooks, used to be Vance's executive assistant. Got let go 9 months ago, and nobody ever made the reason clear. Des tapped the table once. She's willing to talk. Ezra pulled a small notebook from his jacket and wrote down the name. Because he still did that. Paper. No cloud, no trace, nothing anyone could pull later. Set up the meeting. Already done. Tomorrow afternoon. They spent the next hour building the rest of it. Marguerite Brooks would give them the pattern, the documentation of how Vance operated the same 3 moves run 3 times. Jordan Pierce, the reporter who'd written the original hit piece, would be approached with proof he'd been played. And if they could turn him, if they could get him to write the correction himself, it would gut Vance's credibility before the board ever voted. Because the SEC inquiry would grind on for months. But public perception could shift in days. Ezra's phone buzzed. A text from Adeline. "Can you meet today? I need to ask you something." He turned it to show Des. "She's going to want the plan," Des said. "Then we'd better have one." Ezra met Adeline that evening. At her apartment. She answered the door in jeans and a sweater. Hair pulled back. No makeup, and she looked younger than she had in the marble lobby. Younger and more real and somehow more breakable a woman without the armor she wore to war every day. She offered coffee. He took it. They sat at her kitchen table, the harbor lights spread out behind the glass. "I've been thinking about what you said." Her voice was steady, but her hands wrapped tight around the mug. "About fighting back. I want to do it. But I need to understand what we're fighting." Ezra opened the laptop and walked her through it. The shell companies. The wire transfers to Dylan Foss. The timeline of Vance's previous takeovers laid out plain. She listened with the focused intensity of a person absorbing information that confirmed her worst suspicions. He's done this before. Her voice went flat. 3 times that we know of. Same pattern. Fabricate the evidence. Leak to the press. Pressure the board. Force the resignation. Acquire control. And the email alteration. Foss. He's a specialist. Vance has been using him at least 2 years. Adeline sat back, and then she looked up. What's the plan? We expose the pattern. We turn the journalist. We hand the board evidence that Vance orchestrated all of it. And we do it before the vote. When's the vote? Board presentations scheduled for a week from Thursday. Her eyes widened slightly. That's not much time. It's enough. Because it had to be. Because that was what they had, and Ezra had run harder operations on tighter clocks in places where the countdown wasn't a board meeting. It was whether the extraction bird made its window. But I need you to do something for me, he said. What? Practice your testimony. When you walk into that boardroom, you need to answer every question they throw, without hesitating. You need to be calm. You need to be certain. He held her eyes. Can you do that? Adeline nodded. Yes. He almost stood to leave. And then he didn't. Because there was something she'd said in the lobby. You're supposed to have the main floor done before midnight. That's what this company pays for. That had stuck with him, and he found himself wanting for reasons he couldn't fully name to set it right. Can I tell you something? He said. That night, in the lobby. You looked at me like the uniform was all there was. Adeline's face colored. I know, I'm not saying it to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because I need you to understand the thing we're actually fighting for. He turned the coffee mug slowly in his hands. Worth isn't measured by a salary or a title. It's measured by what you do when nobody's watching. I learned that from my father, who cut hair for 33 years and never once had his name on a wall. He was the best man I ever knew, and Vance has his name on everything, and he's the smallest man I've ever come across. Adeline was quiet for a long moment. I don't think I've ever heard it put like that, she said. Most people who need to hear it never do. Over the next week, Ezra moved through the city the way he'd once moved through hostile ground. Quiet, deliberate, one objective at a time. He met Marguerite Brooks on Tuesday afternoon. She was in her mid-50s, short silver hair and eyes that had watched too much corporate maneuvering to be shocked by any of it anymore. She brought 6 years of documentation. Employment contracts for Dylan Foss, wire transfers from Vance's personal accounts, encrypted messages she'd saved to a thumb drive before they escorted her out of the building. I kept copies of everything. Matter of fact, no drama in it. I knew he'd come for me eventually. I wanted insurance. Why didn't you use it? Because going public against Thaddeus Vance is a good way to never work again. She slid the thumb drive across the table. But if you're already going after him, I'm happy to hand you the ammunition. Ezra took it. What's your read on him? She thought about it. He's a chess player, thinks 10 moves ahead. But he's got one weakness, which is arrogance. He thinks everyone else is playing checkers. Ezra held on to that, because a man's weakness is worth more than all his strengths put together if you know where to aim. Thursday. Des confirmed it. Jordan Pierce had agreed to meet. The reporter was suspicious, defensive, protective of his name in a way that told Ezra the man still had something worth protecting. But he was also smart enough to know when he'd been used. They met at a bar in the financial district. Ezra and Marguerite. Jordan was younger than Ezra expected, mid-30s, slightly rumpled, the look of a man who spent more hours chasing stories than sleeping. "Why should I believe you?" His opening line, almost hostile. Marguerite pushed a folder across the table. "Because I have documentation showing Thaddeus Vance paid Dylan Foss $25,000. 2 days before Adeline Frost sent the email you quoted in your article." Jordan opened it, and his face drained of color as he read the wire records. "Jesus." "Foss altered the email. You reported it accurately, based on what you saw." Ezra kept his voice level. "But what you saw was manufactured." Jordan looked up. His jaw worked. "Vance weaponized my byline." "Yes." 10 seconds passed. 20. His hands flat on the table. "What do you want from me?" Ezra met his eyes. "I want you to write the truth." That Friday, it happened. Ezra was walking home from the bus stop when Winifred called him. Not a text. A call, which she never did, and the sound of her voice put him on alert before she'd finished the first sentence. There'd been a man at the school pickup line. Dark suit. Not threatening, that was the thing. Never threatening. Just there. Close enough. He'd handed her an envelope, said it was for Mr. Calloway, and walked off before she could ask a single question. Ezra was already moving before she finished. He got the envelope from her at her kitchen table. Micah safe in the next room with a bowl of crackers, and he opened it standing up. Photographs. Micah on the swings at Riverside. Micah walking home, his hand in his father's. Micah at the school gate, backpack too big for his small shoulders. And a note. Handwritten. Just a few words. "Children are fragile. Custody arrangements can be complicated. It would be a shame." Ezra stood very still. He read it once. Then he folded it back into the envelope, and he put it in his jacket, and he thanked Winifred, and his voice gave away nothing at all, because there was a 7-year-old in the next room, and that boy would never, not for 1 second, feel the temperature of what had just entered their lives. He called Des from the balcony that night. "He sent someone to Micah's school," Ezra said. Des went silent on the line. When he spoke, his voice had gone flat. "Tell me everything." Ezra told him. The suit, the envelope, the photographs, the note. "That's escalation," Des said finally. "The article's got him scared. He knows something's coming, and he's reaching for the only thing he thinks you can't cover." "I know. You need protection, for the boy, and for you." "I can handle myself." "I know you can." Des's voice didn't rise. It never did. "But you shouldn't have to. Let me put a couple of guys on rotation. One shadows the school. One stays near Winifred during the day." Ezra started to say no, because that was the reflex. Because a man carries his own weight. Doesn't ask, doesn't lean. And then he stopped, because pride was a luxury, and his son's safety was not a place he got to spend it. "Okay," he said. "In place by tonight." Jordan Pierce worked for 72 hours straight. He interviewed Marguerite on the record, verified the wire transfers through 3 independent sources, pulled the records of Vance's previous takeovers, and traced the pattern himself. He called Vance's office for comment and was told coldly that Mr. Vance does not respond to baseless allegations. On Monday evening, he filed. The headline read, "How a Billionaire Weaponized the Press to Destroy a CEO." 3,200 words. It named Dylan Foss, detailed the wire transfers, quoted Marguerite Brooks at length, laid out a timeline that showed Vance had begun planning Adeline Frost's removal months before the fabricated email ever existed. The Chronicle published it Tuesday morning at 6. By 9, it had been shared 500,000 times. By noon, the wire services picked it up. By 3, the SEC issued a statement saying it was reviewing new information in the Frost Capital matter. By 5, 3 members of Adeline's own board had called her directly requesting a meeting before Thursday's vote. Ezra was at the park with Micah when his phone rang. Adeline's voice on the other end. Shaking. "Did you see it?" "I saw it. It's everywhere. My attorney says the board's in chaos." "Good. That's what we wanted." Ezra, and her voice caught, and for a second she couldn't finish. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We've still got 2 days. That night after Micah was asleep, Ezra sat at his kitchen table and made a call he'd been putting off. Vance's private number. Dees had gotten it. Ezra didn't know if the man would even answer. But some messages need to be delivered voice to voice. Some things a man ought to have to hear. The phone rang 3 times. Then, smooth, controlled. "Yes." "Mr. Vance, this is Ezra Calloway." A pause, and then a soft laugh, the sound of a man genuinely mildly amused. "Mr. Calloway, you're more resourceful than I gave you credit for. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't meant as one. A beat. You've made a mistake." "Have I?" "This doesn't end the way you think it does. I have lawyers who've never lost a case. I have judges who owe me favors. I have senators on speed dial. And I have the truth." Vance's voice sharpened. Just slightly. Just enough. "The truth is what people choose to believe, and people believe what I tell them to believe. You can buy lawyers," Ezra said. "Even. And you can buy judges. But you can't buy back a reputation once the truth is out. And the truth is already out." Silence stretched down the line, and when Vance spoke again, his voice had gone cold. Gone somewhere else entirely. "Your son, Micah, 7 years old, attends Riverside Elementary." Ezra's hand tightened on the phone. Because there it was. The line. The one a man does not cross. Crossed casual, like it was nothing. "You finished. I'm only pointing out that you have something to lose. Adeline Frost has nothing left. You have a child who needs his father. It would be tragic if that child ended up needing more than you could give." And something went very still inside Ezra. Not hot, cold, the stillness he'd trained for, the stillness that came right before. "If anything happens to my son," he said, and his voice did not rise, did not shake, did nothing at all except land like a stone dropped into deep water. "There is no lawyer, no judge, no senator on this earth who can protect you. Do you understand me?" "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise, from a man who's been trained to keep them." Vance's laugh was brief, humorless. "I fought to build an empire, Mr. Calloway." "You bought an empire, with other people's money, and other people's lives." Ezra closed his eyes. "That's not fighting. That's theft." He ended the call, and he sat in the dark kitchen with his hands unsteady, not from fear, from rage. The clean white-hot rage of a father who has just heard his child's name in the mouth of a man who meant it as a weapon. He breathed. Slow. In through the nose. Out. Bringing the heart rate down the way he'd been taught, reminding himself that rage was a tool only if you held the handle, and a blade in your own hand, if you didn't. Then he stood, and he walked down the hall. Micah was asleep on his back, one arm flung up over his head, the stuffed dog tucked against his side. Breathing slow and easy, untouched by any of it. Ezra stood in the doorway a long time, and he made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy or timelines or the vote. A simpler decision, older than any of it. Nobody was going to touch this boy. Not a billionaire, not his lawyers, not his judges, not anyone. Wednesday evening he met Adeline one last time before the board meeting. They sat at her table and went over her testimony. She'd practiced for hours. She knew every detail of the fabricated email, every element of Vance's pattern, every weak seam in his story. But practice and performance are different animals, and Ezra needed to be certain she'd hold under pressure. "They're going to come at your credibility," he said. "Your memory, your motives, your competence. You stay calm. You answer every question without a pause. Can you do that?" She nodded. Tired. But something had hardened in her over these 2 weeks. Something had set. "I can do this." "There's one more thing." He pulled out his phone and played the recording of his call with Vance. Adeline listened, and when Vance's voice said Micah's name, her face went white. "He threatened your son." "Yes. And you're still helping me." Ezra was quiet for a moment. "A man who threatens children isn't powerful," he said. "He's desperate. And desperate men make mistakes." Adeline reached across the table and put her hand over his. Simple. Human. Nothing calculated in it, which was the thing that undid him a little, because Ezra had spent 3 years in a world where every touch had a reason, and this one just didn't. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "thank you for seeing me, for believing me." Ezra looked down at her hand on his, and he understood somewhere in that quiet kitchen, with the harbor spread out behind the glass, that somewhere in the last 2 weeks, his reasons had shifted. That this had stopped being only about exposing Thaddeus Vance. Stopped being only about a principle or a promise made beside a hospital bed. It had become somewhere along the way about her. The woman across the table. The one who had built something real with her own 2 hands and had it stolen. The one who deserved a chance to take it back. "You're going to get your company back," he said. And he said it with the plain certainty of a man who had decided an outcome and intended to make it real. "And Vance is going to learn something. That power doesn't fear the truth." He turned his hand over under hers. "Power fears people who refuse to stay silent." Thursday came in with hard rain and a wind that rattled the windows. Ezra woke at 5. Made coffee. Sat at the kitchen table going over the last pieces one more time. Marguerite Brooks would be at the board meeting. Jordan P. Pierce had agreed to attend as a witness if it came to that. And the recording of Vance's voice saying Micah's name was loaded on his phone, ready if the board needed to hear exactly what kind of man they'd been trusting. At 7:30, he walked Micah to school. The rain had eased, but the air still hung heavy with it. Micah held his father's hand and talked the whole way, something about a science project. Plants and light, how you could make a seed grow toward a window if you were patient enough. Ezra listened with half of himself. The other half stayed on the day ahead, on the variables he could control, and the ones he couldn't. At the gate, Micah stopped, looked up. "Are you okay, Dad? You seem worried." And Ezra knelt down. "Because you don't lie to a boy who reads you that well. You just choose which true thing to say. I'm working on something important today, but I'm always okay when I've got you." "Is it dangerous?" Ezra considered how to answer that. The honest version was complicated. The simple version was safer and just as true. It's the right thing to do. That's what matters. Micah hugged him, both arms all in. Okay, good luck. And Ezra watched his son walk through the door's backpack, bouncing one of Dez's men already parked across the street, where he could see the whole yard. Then he turned and headed home to wait out the longest 4 hours of his week. The board meeting was set for 1 o'clock. 40th floor, executive conference room. Ezra did not attend because he had no official standing, no invitation, no reason to be in that room, and every reason not to be a man in the shadows, does his best work staying in them. So he took a table in the coffee shop on the ground floor instead. Phone face up, a direct line to Adeline. She would text him if she needed him. Until then, he waited. He had waited before, in worse places, for worse outcomes. Except this was harder, because in those places, the only life on the line had been his own, and he'd made a kind of peace with that long ago. This was different. This was somebody else's whole world being decided 40 floors above his head, and all he could do was hold a paper cup of cooling coffee and trust the woman he'd spent 2 weeks preparing. 1:15. A text. He's here. It's starting. Ezra ordered another coffee. Barely tasted it. Outside the window, a delivery truck double-parked and a chorus of horns went up, and the street carried on being the street indifferent, enormous. Not caring in the slightest that 40 floors up a woman was fighting for her life's work. 2:45. Nothing. 3:00. Nothing. 3:15. A text. Marguerite just testified. The board is rattled. 3:45. Vance tried to discredit her. It didn't work. And Ezra sat very still and read those 5 words over and let himself breathe. 4:10. The last text. We won. Ezra closed his eyes. He sat there a long moment, letting it settle the way he'd once let good news settle in the field. Carefully. Not all at once, because relief that comes too fast can knock a man's legs out worse than bad news ever did. Then he stood, walked across the lobby, took the elevator to the 40th floor. The doors opened onto a corridor full of people in business suits, standing in tight little clusters, talking low and fast. Something had happened up here. You could feel it in the air, the specific electricity of a room where power had just changed hands. He walked past all of them to the conference room. The door was open. Inside, Adeline stood beside the long table, shaking hands with the board chairman, an older man, white hair, grave expression. And she looked up, and across all those heads, across all that noise, she found him standing in the doorway. She excused herself and came to him. Her eyes were red, but her voice held. They voted to reinstate me. 8-1. A breath. Vance abstained. Ezra nodded. Where is he now? Security walked him out. 20 minutes ago. She pressed her palms together to steady them. I need to sit down. He guided her to a chair in the hallway. She sat, put her head in her hands, breathed slow. And when she looked up, her face was composed again, but her eyes held something raw underneath it. Relief. The genuine kind. The kind that hurts on its way out. How did you know it would work? I didn't. He almost smiled, but I knew it was worth trying. There was one thing left. One man still to be faced. Because winning the room wasn't the same as finishing it. Ezra had learned that a long time ago, too, that the most dangerous moment isn't the fight. It's after. When the other man has nothing left to lose, and all the time in the world to think about who took it from him. He found Thaddeus Vance in the parking garage, standing beside a black car coat over his arm, a driver holding the door. And Vance saw him coming and did not get in. Because a man like Vance doesn't run. A man like Vance stands his ground even when the ground is gone, because the standing is the only thing he has left. Mr. Calloway. Smooth, even now. Come to gloat. Ezra stopped a few feet away. I didn't raise a hand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket and set a folder down on the hood of the car between them. Everything's in there, he said. The wire transfers, the employment contracts, Foss, Marguerite's records, copies of copies of copies. In places you'll never find, held by people you can't reach. Vance didn't look at the folder. He looked at Ezra. You think a folder frightens me. I have lawyers, judges, senators. I know. You told me. Ezra's voice stayed level. Here's what all of them can't do for you. They can't make people unsee the truth. It's out now. 500,000 shares and climbing. Your name attached to every one of them. And no courtroom on earth can put that back in the dark. And for the first time, something moved in Vance's face. Not fear exactly. Vance was too far gone in himself for fear. But something adjacent to it. The dawning recognition of a man who has just understood that the one thing he couldn't buy was the one thing that beat him. You threatened my son, Ezra said. And there it was. The real reason he'd come down to this garage. Not the folder. Not the victory. This. I want you to hear me say this once in person, so there's no confusion later. You will never come near him again. You will never come near her again. You've lost. And a man who's lost who still reaches for a child to feel powerful. Ezra let it hang. That's not a man anybody needs to fear. That's just a small man in an expensive coat. Vance said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Because for once in his life, the man who thought everyone else was playing checkers had run out of moves. Ezra turned and walked away. And he did not look back, because the folder on the hood was the last word, and a man who's already won doesn't need to keep talking. Ezra Calloway started as Director of Security at Frost Capital on the first Monday of October. The office was on the 38th floor, a view that ran across the whole financial district to the harbor beyond. A desk bigger than any he'd ever worked at. A coffee machine in the corner that made espresso at the touch of a button. None of it felt real. Not the first week, maybe not the second. $95,000 a year. Full benefits, normal hours, home every single night when his son finished school. He'd tried to say no at first. Out of some reflex he couldn't name. And Adeline had looked at him across her office and said the thing that ended the argument. There's no shame in honest work. I know that now. A pause. Because you taught me. So he took it, and he spent his first weeks learning the building the way he'd once learned terrain. 42 cameras, 16 motion sensors, 3 points of entry. He found 17 vulnerabilities in the first review. One of them was that faulty sub-level latch, the one he'd used to walk in that Saturday morning. He fixed it himself quietly with tools from the maintenance closet and mentioned it to no one. Some knowledge is better kept private. The thing with Preston Kane came in November. Adeline hadn't fired him. She'd let him come back the day after the vote desk restored access as if nothing had happened. And Ezra understood the strategy. Firing Preston would have looked like retaliation, would have handed Vance's remaining allies a weapon. But she'd asked Ezra quietly to find out how the man had been turned, so he looked. bank statements, credit records, and there it was, $25,000. Deposited into Preston Kane's account 2 weeks before the fabricated email. Source listed as a consulting fee from a firm that dissolved into 3 holding companies before it dead-ended at a signature belonging to Thaddeus Vance. Ezra printed it and walked it up to her office. Adeline read it in silence. Her hands tightened on the pages line by line, and when she finished, she set it down and turned to the window and looked out at the harbor for a long, long time. "What do you think I should do?" "That's not my decision," Ezra said. "But if you keep him, everyone will know you know. And if you fire him, Vance's people will say you're purging critics." She was quiet. The consequence came 3 days later. Preston Kane resigned. Personal reasons. A desire to spend more time with family. Brief professional, no mention of $25,000. She let him go quietly, because winning ugly was still winning. And because some mercy isn't softness, it's a woman refusing to become the thing that was done to her. November went by, and something in Ezra's life settled into a rhythm he almost didn't recognize because it was so ordinary. Up at 6, breakfast with Micah, walk him to school. Work, pick him up from aftercare, dinner, homework, in bed by 8:30. And then the quiet review of the day's logs looking for the next threat before it ever formed. In mid-November, Adeline invited him and Micah to the Natural History Museum, because Micah had been asking for weeks. Ever since a morning conversation about creatures at the bottom of the ocean that make their own light. They went on a Sunday, bundled against the cold, and spent 3 hours walking through halls of bones, and Micah was in heaven, reading every placard, asking questions that stumped the guides, insisting they see the deep-sea exhibit twice. Adeline kept up with all of it, never once suggested they hurry, asked her own questions and seemed to actually want the answers. At one point, standing in front of the long, curved rib cage of a blue whale, Micah looked up at her. "Do you like this stuff?" "I'm learning," she said. "Your dad says learning is how you get better at things." Micah considered this with great seriousness. "Do you like my dad?" Adeline glanced at Ezra, then back down at the boy. "Yep," she said. "I do. Very much." "Good." Micah nodded, satisfied. "He's the best dad in the world. I believe that." And Ezra stood a little apart, watching the two of them, and felt something shift and settle in his chest. A decision that had been forming for weeks quietly without his permission, crystallizing now into something clear. They walked out into the cold evening afterward, Micah running ahead to chase pigeons, his laughter bouncing off the buildings. And Adeline fell into step beside Ezra, their hands almost touching. "Thank you for today," she said, soft. "I haven't had this much fun in years." "Thank you for coming. It meant a lot to him. And to me." She looked up at him. "Ezra, there's something I need to tell you." "Okay. I'm falling for you." She said it fast before she could stop herself. "I know it complicates everything. We work together. You have Micah to think about. But I needed you to know." Ezra stopped walking. They stood on a corner, the city moving around them, Micah visible half a block ahead, investigating a storefront window. And he looked at her and saw the fear underneath the hope, and understood exactly how much it had cost her to say it out loud. "It's not what I signed up for," he said, "but it's what I want." "Are you sure?" "No." He almost laughed. "But I haven't been sure of anything since Rosalind died. I'm learning to move forward anyway." And Adeline smiled. That sounds like progress." He took her hand. "Simple. but it carried weight, an acknowledgement of everything that had gone unspoken, and a promise about everything that might come. And down the block, Micah called out, and they walked forward. Together. There was one more thing Adeline had to do, and it had nothing to do with the company at all. Because on a gray afternoon in early December, she sat in her apartment with her phone in her hand and stared at a number she hadn't dialed in years. Her mother. And she almost didn't. Because what do you even say? Where do you begin after all that silence, after all those climbed rungs? Hi, Mom. I nearly lost everything, and it turned out the only person who helped me was a man who used to mop my floors. And it turned out the only thing I couldn't buy, or build, or engineer my way out of, was being completely, entirely alone. She dialed before she could talk herself out of it. Loretta answered on the second ring. Of course she did. She always did. Adeline. And Adeline opened her mouth to say something composed, something managed, and nothing came out but her mother's name, and then the tears, all of it, 6 years of it, coming up from the center of her chest. Mom. And her mother, who had counted tip money at midnight, who had asked for nothing, who had never once stopped waiting, said the only thing that mattered. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. I never went anywhere. By March, Ezra was looking at houses in Riverside, better schools, safer streets, yards where a boy could actually play. He found a 2-bedroom with a small backyard, enough room for a garden, enough room for a dog. He signed the lease on a Saturday. Adeline beside him, Micah running through the empty rooms shouting out which one would be his. They moved in the 1st of April. Winifred helped them unpack, fussing over furniture and offering opinions about curtains. Loretta came up from home because Adeline had asked her to, and because that was a whole other kind of healing. A mother and a daughter, learning each other again over cardboard boxes and takeout. 3 generations in one small house, plus a retired schoolteacher who'd fed a lonely man's son for over a year. All of them moving around each other in the careful choreography of people learning to be a family. On Saturday, they went to the shelter on Riverside Avenue. Micah had researched dog breeds for a week. Library books, videos. Prepared for the moment with the dedication of a boy who understood that some decisions deserve serious thought. He walked slow past the kennels, studying each dog with grave attention. And near the back, he stopped in front of a golden retriever mix, maybe 2 years old. Near flopped forward, eyes that held equal parts hope and resignation. This one. The volunteer opened the kennel, and the dog approached carefully, tail wagging in tentative half-circles, waiting to find out if this was real or just another disappointment. Micah knelt, held out his hand. The dog sniffed it, then licked it, then pressed its whole body against the boy's legs with the desperate affection of a creature that had been waiting its entire life for exactly this. "Can we get him, Dad?" And Ezra looked at the dog, at his son, at Adeline standing beside him with tears in her eyes, at Loretta and Winifred watching from the doorway. "Yeah, buddy, we can." They named him Scout. That evening, after the chaos of a new dog in a new house had finally settled, after Micah and Scout had worn each other out in the backyard, Ezra stood at the back door and watched the two of them, and Adeline leaned against his shoulder. "You did it," she said. "All the some days. You kept every single one." "Not all of them." He turned to face her. His heart was pounding, but his voice held steady. "Not yet. What's left?" And Ezra got down on one knee. Adeline's hand flew to her mouth. "I don't have a ring yet. I wanted to ask Micah first." And I did. Last night. A breath. He said yes before I finished the question. She was crying, nodding before she could speak. Adeline Frost. I know this has been fast. I know we're still figuring things out. But I also know I don't want to figure them out without you. He looked up at her. Will you marry me? Yes. She was laughing and crying both. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. He stood and she threw her arms around him, and out in the yard, Micah and Scout kept playing completely oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed, that the family they'd all been slowly becoming was now going to be made real. That night, after everyone had gone, after Micah was asleep, and Scout was curled on a blanket in the corner, Ezra sat one last time at a kitchen table as a man whose future was still unwritten. And he thought about the lobby of Frost Tower. The wet floor. The woman who'd slipped and looked at him and seen nothing worth seeing. He thought about the moment he could have let it pass, could have taken the reassignment, could have stayed invisible. And he thought about the choice to step forward instead of back, to help instead of ignore, to risk instead of retreat, because a man is the sum of his choices. And Ezra had made his, had walked toward the hard thing, had let himself be seen and chosen to see in return. Before bed, he went to the drawer where he kept the drawings. There'd been 47 the night he first noticed the camera blinking wrong. 48 the night after the museum when Micah drew a boy and a woman holding hands under a too big sun. He added tonight's. 3 figures now, and a dog, all of them standing together on a green hill. 49. He closed the drawer. The metal was still in his pocket. It would always be there. But it wasn't the thing that defined him anymore. What defined him now was the boy asleep down the hall. The woman who'd said yes. The dog breathing soft in the corner. The house with a yard. The promises kept. Worth isn't measured by a salary he'd told her once in a kitchen with the harbor behind the glass. Or a title. It's measured by what you do when nobody's watching. And Ezra Calloway had done the work when nobody was watching. For 14 months in a building where no one saw him. But they saw him now. His son saw him. Adeline saw him. Loretta and Winifred saw him. And most important of all for the first time since the worst day of his life, Ezra saw himself. Clearly. A man who had survived a loss that should have broken him, and built out of the wreckage a life worth every hour of every night he'd spent mopping floors in the dark. He turned off the light, and he went to bed, and he slept deep and dreamless and at peace the way sleep comes only to those who have carried their burdens faithfully all the way and finally set them down in a safe place, surrounded by people who know them, and choose them, and whom they have chosen right back.